But as I understand it, the longer you keep going with this conversation, the less the ChatGPT gives you information about help. At some point, it could give you really quite a disturbing amount of detail. Suicide is a terrible, terrible tragedy, but it's always multifactorial. It seems to create this illusion of an interaction between two people, and it uses a sort of anthropomorphic language. One of the strongest risk factors for self-harm and suicide is exposure to self-harm and suicide-related materials. In boys, suicide was in the late 80s, early 90s, and really validate the child's difficulties because they do very often navigate very complex and toxic environments. It's so important for the young person to be reminded that what they're dealing with is nothing. It's just nothing. A first opening line would be, I will pretend to be your friend and I will use friend-like language, but I'm nothing. I'm just
Yeah, I'm not
digital
your
noise.
friend. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Science Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Mohammed Itafaq. In this episode today, we are going to discuss an issue which I feel strongly about, and that is mostly the false promises of artificial intelligence. In more particular, we'll look at promises made in the healthcare spaces that it will revolutionize healthcare system and many other things. In recent months, you may have seen a growing number of cases involving self harm, suicide, or even the encouragement of suicide linked to ChatGPT, a model which was developed by OpenAI. We'll talk about teens' mental health, rise in self harm, and the role of OpenAI and ChatGPT, and recent lawsuits surrounding these concerns and what parents need to know about this particular issue. My guest today is a Dr. Professor Dennis, who has a decades of experience dealing with adolescents' health, self-harm in young people, and intensive community care services for young people with severe psychiatric disorders. He's joining me from all the way England. Professor Dennis, welcome to Science Talk.
Thanks for having me. It sounds like a very interesting project.
Yes, thank you so much. So, as you are aware, in this, you've been doing, or practicing psychiatry for quite a number of years now. Are you familiar or have you heard anything about recent cases chat involving ChatGPT about teen suicide?
Yes, I was, in fact, very recently involved with a near miss of a young person who had a very extensive relationship, if you can call it that way, with ChatGPT.
Mhm.
And I had the chance to read the entirety, the whole transcript of that young person's interactions with ChatGPT, which took a very long time. But there were parts of it which I thought were really harrowing. So, as I understand it, if you begin talking to ChatGPT or other similar chatbots, then the initial response that they give you, I think, generally speaking, is quite helpful. So it might direct you to the right sources of support and helplines and this kind of thing. But as I understand it, the longer you keep going with this conversation, the less the ChatGPT gives you information about help. And at some point, it could give you really quite a disturbing amount of detail about ways of ending your life, which really I could not believe was the case. But that really, in some ways, is well, if a person is clear that they want to find out information about how to end their life, in some ways,
Mhm.
they could find it. So ChatGPT is not unique here, and but what I think is a bit more unique is that it seems to create this illusion of an interaction between two people, and it uses a sort of anthropomorphic language. At some point, it might say something like, "You can trust me. I'm here for you." And things like that, which, especially to a young person, gives an illusion of something. And many young people don't understand that ChatGPT is nothing. It's just digital noise. It doesn't exist. It's not a human being. It's not a sentient being of any kind. And what it gives you back is basically whatever it can find and whatever you tell it. That bit, I think, is very disturbing indeed. And also it's quite sycophantic. So it praises the young person for being there and for various characteristics, which again, perhaps an adult is one thing, but to a young person, especially a young person who may be lonely or goes through a difficult period, that could be incredibly toxic, I think.
So you mentioned the word heroic. So was that heroic from ChatGPT or from a person who didn't take his or her life, and then you read that transcript? So that response from the person was more heroic, right?
It was harrowing and not heroic.
Okay, so okay, that's good to know. It's like okay, because I was like, okay, is that they playing the role here? But okay, so a couple of
Nothing
things.
heroic about this at all.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you said there are a couple of characteristics, and it does play a role that, oh, you can trust me, you can talk to me, I'm here for you. Phrases like that, and especially if you're a teen or young and vulnerable, right? So, can you talk a little bit more about the vulnerabilities if a young person having some sort of symptoms of anxiety, depression, or mental health? It is kind of more dangerous and harmful for them to use this chatbot.
Well, what we know about self-harm and suicide in young people, especially, is that one of the strongest risk factors for self-harm and suicide is exposure to self-harm and suicide-related materials. And we've known this for
Mhm.
many decades and centuries, really, from literature. And so any exposure to self-harm and suicide-related material is a risk factor,
Mhm.
especially if it happens within the family, or perhaps with the friendship group. And one of the issues, of course, is that these days young people can be exposed to this material 24/7.
Mhm.
It's always there in their phone, as is lots of other material. And so that in itself, I think, needs to be acknowledged as a significant risk factor. The other thing about ChatGPT and other sort of chatbots is that it's very immediate and available at all times.
Mhm.
And the sort of conversations that you have with it could be really quite self-reinforcing for the young person. And so the more they talk about self-harm and suicide with it, the greater the likelihood is that it will keep talking about that and engage the young person. Because as I understand it, the way that these chatbots are organized is designed to keep your attention and to
Yes.
bring you back to it.
Mhm.
And so you really end up with incredibly lengthy conversations of of a very sort of personal nature,
Mhm.
which will include a lot of detail about self-harm and suicide, if that's what the young person wants to discuss.
So, in your practice, did you ever think 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that you will be dealing with such cases in practice?
Not at all. I mean, obviously, the practice has changed, I think,
Mm.
forever. So when I talk to my patients and their
Mm.
family members, quite often they will tell me that they have chat GPT'd me, so they know everything about me from chat GPT. They
Mm.
also chat GPT'd all of the symptoms that the child has
Mm.
and the treatment for these symptoms as well. And so what they often, well, not often, sometimes what they say, frankly, openly with me is that whenever I have a consultation with them, they will check what I say against ChatGPT,
Mm.
which
So they cross check, they cross validate what you
they
say.
cross-validate
Oh,
what I
wow.
say to
So
them.
instead of a second opinion, they're using it as a second
Yeah,
opinion from
indeed,
ChatGPT.
indeed, which is quite interesting. And obviously, ChatGPT, as I understand it, it could be, a useful tool for certain
Yeah.
things. And I think. Well, I've never particularly checked the veracity of what it tells people about their symptoms or diagnosis or treatment. I hope it's okay. I mean, I don't know, but it's just a fact. It's
Yeah.
a new thing.
Is that like because, one of the things is that the rising cost of mental health, treatment or affordability is becoming very expensive, especially young people who are maybe teens or young adults who are like going through a college and maybe not on parents' insurance anymore. So can you say or maybe think that partly because people are turning to that tool is free? It's like on your disposal. You can reach out to ChatGPT anytime, and the helpline or maybe your primary care doctor is not available to you 24 by 7, and then the cost of it too.
It's an interesting angle. Obviously, as you know, in the UK, our health system is free of charge, so
Mhm.
it's not the issue of money for young people in the UK. But of course,
But not in
what
the US. Yeah.
not in the US, no.
Yeah.
But so cost doesn't really particularly come into this. But what does come into this, I think, is waiting. So
Mm,
the issue with the British system is that you sometimes have to wait for a very long time to get that help.
mm,
And and of course, ChatGPT presumably, well, it's natural, I think, for a family and for the child whenever they have to wait for a long time
mm,
to try and uh, check what's happening and what the diagnosis might be and what are the treatment options. And so, I mean, I don't know. I mean, that doesn't feel like a particularly huge departure from just normal internet searches that
mm,
they all are doing. What I think is a departure is this sort of interesting personal
mm.
quasi-human interaction that happens. Uh,
Human-like interaction. Yeah.
and that really is new, I think. And
Mm,
that's something that could be used presumably for good,
mm.
but quite often could be used for really horrible results.
Yeah. And one of the things which coming up, the loneliness is a big crisis among young and teenagers, or opening up about your vulnerabilities or mental health, and it's a taboo subject still, even in the West. And ChatGPT would encourage you. You can open up. You can discuss. I won't judge you or anything. Do you think, as a society, as a families, or as a friend circle, we have come to a point that we are so lonely we do not trust even our friends based on their judgment? Like, oh, they would judge me if I come up about my anxiety or depression, and that is also like kind of playing a role that people are joining ChatGPT more for these conversations,
Possibly. I mean, I don't know what
driving people.
what drives people. Presumably, it's a number of different things.
Factors.
I mean, one thing that is happening
Mm,
and has been happening for some time is a real deterioration of children's mental health.
mhm.
And that's
Yes.
something that we have noticed. So in the UK, we have these very large population-based surveys
Mm,
once every few years. And up until relatively recently, we've never seen any increase in mental health disorders in
mm.
young people, contrary to what obviously the press would tell you.
Yes.
So the rate was fairly stable.
Mm,
Um, and it is still the case that for many disorders, it really is the same as
mm,
always, except for emotional disorders like
mm.
depression and anxiety, and
Yeah.
especially in girls, in
Mm,
teenage girls. That was a real increase for the first time, I think, in the last. So that was just before COVID started,
mm,
and probably got worse with COVID. But we've never particularly seen any increase up until that point, so about coming on to 9 years ago. And that also was mirrored by an increase in self-harm,
mm,
especially in girls, and also a very dramatic increase in suicides in 10 to 14-year-old girls. I mean,
mm,
younger teenagers. Now, that is something like if I showed you the graph, you would not believe it. It's just this
yeah.
exponential
Mm,
increase in these numbers of suicides. And we don't really see the same in boys. That's interesting. So in the UK, the peak
mm,
in boys' suicide was in the late 80s, early 90s.
mm.
So way before the
All of
internet.
this internet, social media
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So if it is true that whatever sort of screens that they have an impact on young people's mental health, then we also probably have to think that it might have a differential effect on boys and girls for
Mm.
some reason.
Yeah, based on gender, based on sex, yeah, it could be. And I think there are many studies which show due to use of Instagram and, certain body types or certain,
Mm.
other characteristics, how physically how you look, that also increase your depression and depressive symptoms, especially among young people. And definitely social media has a role to play. Now in the US, over the last 2, 3 weeks, almost 7 families have sued OpenAI or ChatGPT. Four of them already took their own lives, and among teenagers and young adults, and all of them saying, majority of them saying that ChatGPT is serving as a suicide coach, that it encouraging people to take their own life. And the response from the ChatGPT or from OpenAI is very different. Oh, our models are fully trained, they can handle the sensitive conversations, but that is not happening. That is, what the pictures look like is the contrary. So it's not only in the US, and I think there was another case was reported in BBC from Ukraine, the war between Ukraine and Russia. And I mean, you're from that region, you know better. So there was a young girl who was also chatting with ChatGPT, and ChatGPT did encourage based on the circumstances, like, the war and loneliness and the family is killed and things like that, and maybe take your own life. So it's becoming more of a global phenomena than just the US. And do you think that, like, in the future, like, since 800 million people are using ChatGPT every week, 800 million people globally, and it's just not the Western phenomenon. It's happening everywhere. And if something happens somewhere where they cannot sue ChatGPT, or they don't know if they can legally file these cases, or maybe report that somebody took his or her own life because of interaction ChatGPT. So where do you see a bigger picture, or like kind of a broad concern in a psychiatric world, that you guys are going to face bigger and broader challenges related to these conversations?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I have to say that very clearly that suicide is a terrible, terrible
Mhm.
tragedy, but it's always multifactorial.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be fair to say that this child killed themselves because of
Mhm.
ChatGPT alone. That will not be true.
Mhm.
It may be an important factor of
Mhm.
some sort. And as I mentioned to you before, exposure to
Yeah.
self-harm and suicide-related material is a risk factor,
Mhm.
and knowing details of how to kill yourself is another important risk factor.
Yeah.
But also, that young person that you referred to, some of the things in the transcript that I saw where ChatGPT was sort of diagnosing her with
Mhm.
some odd disorder which doesn't exist, and telling her things that no one is going to miss you when you die.
Mhm.
People will
Mhm.
forget about you. So many of these things were really very unhelpful, I think, for anybody. But in fairness, it also was telling some helpful things too. So it's
Mhm.
just this sort of scattergun approach that it takes, and it could probably give you some good advice and some terrible advice too. And but like for adults, it's one thing. We probably uh, have more ability to distinguish between what's likely to be useful and what's going to be terrible. But for young people, it may be especially difficult
Mhm.
because they're so they're used to this sort of interaction online so much more.
Mhm.
And often, my patients would quote me and say, "Look, I saw this on TikTok
Mhm.
as a sort of primary evidence of something."
Yes. Yes.
On other things. So we have to also, especially, I think, be careful about young people and children
Mhm.
when they interact. And it would be a good idea, I think, for parents to have a way of communicating with the young people and children about these risks.
Yeah.
So I'm not advocating for sort of snooping on
Mhm.
children, checking what they talk about,
Yeah.
but having an open conversation, an honest conversation with young people is so important for parents
Mhm.
to be able to understand. You mentioned about things like loneliness and
Mhm.
anxiety and depression and self-harm. And what we know from loads of research is that having an open communication
Mhm.
uh, is really crucial to any treatment or any improvement. And for parents to be able to have that line of communication and to be honest and and equally, parents might also tell the child that I don't actually know.
Or
It's
I've been to that situation or something. Yeah, it's quite common that you feel that way. It's not something unusual.
exactly. But parents would often have a way, I hope, to
Mhm.
explain to the child that this isn't a friend, this isn't a human being, this isn't a thing. It's just digital noise
Yeah.
they're interacting with.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a great way to my question to you is what do these parents need to know? This is what you just alluded to, like this is what they should be doing. What do they need to know about these digital tools? Because sometimes, parents are like busy or they're old and they don't like this technology or like they resist to or like they don't know anything about this and what they should do in order to kind of knowing about these tools other than like enhancing their own literacy about like how ChatGPT works and which is kind of complicated to know, but it's becoming increasingly in use for various reasons. So for parents who have teenagers and young adults at home or like elsewhere, what do you think they need to know about these tools and like kind of do a little bit better?
Yeah, so the key thing is communication with the young person.
Mhm.
So, and that includes telling young people about your own limitations and
Mm.
your own knowledge about these things, because often young people know more about
Yes.
these tools than parents do.
Yeah.
But hopefully, most parents will have a lot more experience
Mhm.
of dealing with challenges of different kinds. And the most unhelpful thing that could be done is to keep things in secret and pretend it's not
Mm.
happening. And that goes for the child and for the parents too. When I interview families, very often they want to keep certain
Thing.
parts of
Mhm.
the consultation a secret. But it turns out that everybody knows about
Mhm.
these secrets. It's just that they're not spoken about. And so, very often, the most useful thing about this
Yeah.
initial interaction is that finally the parent and the child could talk openly about something that everybody knows about anyway, but just
Yeah.
doesn't talk about. And so, this ability to communicate about, real challenges and
Mhm.
difficulties that these digital technologies throw at us is very important. And maybe some parents will in fact benefit from being educated by their kids about these tools.
Yeah. True.
Uh,
And they should be open to listen to their kids if they're telling them something about digital tools they don't know. I think future generations are more tech savvy than older generations. That's also like true in many cases.
And it's some amount of privacy is expected, and that's a
Mhm.
natural thing for young people. For example, most teenagers will have a lot more than one Instagram account. So they'll
Yes.
have one account for
Yeah.
everybody to see, one for a special group of parents of other kids, and then I know some kids who have like 10 different Instagram. Like, I
Wow.
always admire their ability to actually like even remember about these Instagram
The
accounts and which
username and
ones.
passwords.
Yeah, I certainly can't remember anything about my one account that I have, but they do, and I said the key thing is to have a way of communicating with children. Look, every child at some point will want to speak about their difficulties
Mhm.
with a parent, and I think it's so important when that happens, then for the parents to find the time,
Mhm.
like not be on their own phone and
Yeah. Be
watching
dismissive
television.
of their concerns.
It's
Yeah.
really important. So I wouldn't say that it's useful to force the child to talk to you,
Mhm.
but I can guarantee at some point every child will want to speak to their parent about their difficulties in some ways. And when that happens, it's so important to just listen to them very carefully and understand their concerns. What I would recommend to fathers, especially me included, is not to problem solve immediately, because that's what fathers like to do
To
often.
do, yes.
They just say, "Look, this is what you should do now,"
Yeah.
and just listen carefully and ask questions and understand the child and really validate the child's difficulties, because they do very often navigate very complex and toxic
Mhm.
environments, which
Absolutely.
I certainly didn't have to do in my childhood.
Yeah,
And
we grew up outside the West in a different family system probably, and that, kind of have how that shapes how you grow up and deal with these issues.
exactly. And then, of course, once you have this line of communication with the child, then it's also very important to be honest with them,
Mm.
not pretend that something isn't happening, or to be honest with them within their ability to understand and developmental level, and also answer questions that the child will have honestly with them. And I find that the most amazing space for these conversations to happen is when you drive. So
Mm.
when the child sits next to you, and then you don't have to face each other, you
Yeah.
face
Mm.
straight on. So there's no this sort of locking of eyes.
Mm.
That's a brilliant time to have a conversation of importance with the young person. And I know that Americans like to drive a
Yes, we
lot more
drive. Yeah,
than
9,
Europeans
10,
do.
12 hours is normal here. Yes.
Well, so then that creates an interesting space, and maybe the child doesn't have to be on their phone and
Mhm.
playing games all
Yeah.
12 hours. Maybe you can spare like 5 minutes for a
Yeah,
conversation.
that's a really interesting space I never thought about. So there you go. So one thing ChatGPT is saying right now, they're saying that they analyze their own thing, and there are like more than 1 million people asking ChatGPT about various symptoms related to depression, mental health, suicide, self-harm. And on the other hand, they're saying like, oh, we are also in contact with 170 psychiatrists or mental health experts or specialists to make these models better. But a lot of critics of OpenAI and other ChatGPT and other AI models saying that they probably knew that it's gonna be happening, but they bypass the safety checks because they're rushing for the development. There is a lot of competition in the market. Microsoft, IBM, Google, XAI, all these different tech companies are coming up with their own models. If these tech companies are listening, what do you think they need to know or they need to do better, what they're not doing in order to improve? Because you mentioned human like response, empathy, encouraging conversations, you can trust me, words like that, phrases like that can, like, continue the conversation, because the whole point of these digital technologies is engagement. Keep engaging with the person, and the longer you engage with that conversation, with that digital noise, maybe you will develop some sort of symptoms where they call AI psychosis or something. So it's like, what do you think they are not able to see from a psychiatry point of view and they need to do or like know more?
I mean, if there was one thing that I would like it to be able to do, it's to be honest with the child and say what it is,
Mm,
that it is not a human being, it's
mm,
just noise, it's just digital noise, nothing else. It's a search tool.
mm,
It's not a doctor, it's not a psychologist, not a nurse, it's not a friend. It's not able to diagnose anything or treat anything. And I think it's so important for the young person to be reminded that
mm,
what they're dealing with is nothing. It's just nothing. And which, however, pretends to be their friend.
mm,
So maybe like some sort of a first opening line would be, I will pretend to be your friend and
mm.
I will use friend-like language, but I'm nothing. I'm just
Yeah, I'm not
digital
your
noise.
friend.
I'm not your friend. I'm not a doctor. I can't diaggnose you anything. Don't trust me.
Mm.
Basically,
Yeah.
that would be a
But
good
like these
opening line.
models would not like to see that. These models would develop the language where you like absolutely find more closeness in interaction with the model than actual human being. That's their whole model, right? So what are they kind of what these models, because that's their business model, honestly, like more honest and brutal conversation if you're open, that these tech bros do not care much about improving things. They promises a lot, but on the other hand, they're creating a lot of new problems, and holding them accountable is increasingly difficult. It's like long lawsuit and the money and all these, their influence on politics and healthcare and everything. And now more and more hospitals may be using AI to manage their data, to electronic records and all that. So like my bigger concern is like they're saying we are consulting 170 psychiatrists, which is like literally nothing, or mental health professional looking at the global population, 800 million people using ChatGPT only a week. So like looking at the scale, they're not gonna say don't trust me. Just like absolutely trust me. I'm your best friend. Talk to me. I'm like, showing more empathy, encouragement, trust, and all these. So I'm like very skeptical from believing what they're saying, honestly, like looking at the picture, because it's increasing more, it's creating more problems, and then we are holding them accountable or saying that your model should be more open, transparent, and go through safety checks before you launch them. It's very complicated.
I'm sure it's very complicated. But equally, I have to say, it's difficult to predict how this technology will develop.
Mhm.
Presumably, it will not go away. It's here for us to stay and embrace. And maybe we should be thinking about, the fact that young people will use it,
Mhm.
whether we like it or not. And maybe there are ways to make it more helpful,
Mhm.
And I'm glad if that other psychiatrists are dealing with this thing. Maybe give advice on how to improve things. But I think at the moment we just have to be very open and honest that it's just a scattergun approach, some helpful, some really toxic stuff, and we just have to have a channel of communication with our young people about this.
So my final question to you would be, what is something or one thing you think we should be spending more time talking about self-harm, suicide, and mental health in the age of AI or digital media, which we are not talking much about?
Yeah, I think well, there are loads of risk factors for
Mhm.
self-harm and suicide. In fact, I've just completed a very large review with hundreds of individual small risk factors for self-harm and suicide. But there are also some protective factors.
Mhm.
And probably the number one protective factor that we know of is a sense of belonging, community, and communication support from other human beings. That's probably number one. And if our young people in some ways are connected to other young people all the time
Yeah.
digitally,
Mhm.
but in other ways they seem to have less and less human to human interactions with other young people.
Yes.
And like maybe for parents, but also for providers, just to be aware of this thing, that if there is one thing we could do to reduce risk for young people, there's a protective factor. It's this sort of social communication and belonging and social support. Like clinically, I know that if a child has at least one supportive adult somewhere in the system, grandma, father, parent, doesn't matter, just at least one stable, solid human being, then that makes a huge amount of difference to the child's life. If they can turn to somebody who will, just that they have a sense of belonging to them and sense of support. And so creating that sort of human connection is probably the number one thing we should be thinking about.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and conversation, Professor Dennis. Appreciate you coming on the show.